Well, we finished up the tape coat. Now we're moving on to the fill coat.
We're using wider taping knives, 8 to 10 inches.
And we're also dealing with the mud a little bit differently. And we aren't pressing quite as hard. And we're also switching from a basic all-purpose joint compound to a lightweight all-purpose joint compound. It's a little bit easier to smooth out into sand.
For the long tapered joints, I use an 8-inch knife to put more mud right down the middle. Remember, there should still be a slight depression where the tape is. Then I smooth it out with a couple of strokes. I make 2 strokes down the edges of the mud, a little below the joint and a little above it. When I do these strokes, I press harder on the side of the knife that's away from the middle of the joint, and I let the other side float a little. Then I do a final stroke down the middle. This should level it out and get rid of any ridge marks in the center.
The butt joints, or where the square edges of the drywall meet, will probably have a little hump here where the tape is. So consequently, we'll have to feather these out a little bit wider than we will a typical recessed joint. Now, the way you do this is by putting the joint compound on the sides of the joint, not in the middle. I like to use an 8-inch knife, and as I apply the mud, I try to put one edge of the knife right in the middle of the joint. This way, I'll only be putting a tiny bit of mud on the top of the hump. Then I start taking off the excess mud and smoothing everything out. Now you do the edges first and then the center. As you do the edges, press harder on the outside of the knife so that you're feathering the edge. Now you'll be tempted to keep going over and over until it's perfectly smooth, but you don't have to. It's perfectly okay to leave a couple of ridges at the end of the coat.
For the outside corners, we again work one side at a time, layering more joint compound into the area next to the corner bead. When I smooth the mud out, as always, I put more pressure on the outside to get the nice feathered effect onto the wall. Then I take another stroke with the pressure on the corner bead and a final gentle stroke where I'm floating the knife right down the middle.
Now we also put another thin coat of mud on the screw heads to fill the small depression that was formed when the first coat dried and shrank.
For the inside corners, the angles, we switch back to our trusty 6-inch knife and apply the mud on one side. Just like on the tape coat, it's best to try to only load up one side of the knife so you don't end up with too much mud on the wall. Then I take the mud off. The first stroke feathers out the edge. On the second stroke, I clean up anything that's squeezed onto the other side of the corner. On the last stroke, go back to the first side and smooth out the part that's closest to the corner. Now you're going to want to do this side next, but you're not going to be able to without messing up the first side. So we'll do this side tomorrow when we do the third coat. And today we're starting what may be our final coat. It's called the finish coat. And the whole idea is to apply a little bit more mud to make everything as smooth and even and as level as possible. Now each time before we start our new coat, we run a knife over everything to knock down any ridges. It's easier and safer than sanding.
Now as we feather out the joints, they tend to get a little wider. So for that we need wider knives, up to 12 inches for our joints. For the finish coat, it's a good idea to check your joint before you mud to see what sort of situation you've got to deal with. Finishing off the long recessed joints is a lot like we did on the second coat, except we moved up to 12-inch knives. Now the first thing we do is to apply the mud to the middle of the joint. Then we take our standard 3 strokes to smooth it out, one across the bottom, one across the top, and one right down the middle. We try to do all of our recessed joints first. This way they'll be dry when we have to do the butt joints and we won't mess up what we've just done.
To finish off the outside corners, we start by scraping down the edge and scraping down any ridges in the mud. Then I apply the mud. Even though I'm using an 8-inch knife, I let about 2 inches of it hang out past the corner bead so that I'm not applying a full 8-inch band of mud. To take the mud off, I run the knife down the outside edge with pressure on the outside. And then I make a final stroke with fairly even pressure against the bead and the wall. And I use my knife to take off any globs that are stuck on the metal edge. Of course, our nail and screw heads get one final coat of mud.
The final coat for the butt joints requires the most delicate touch of all. We like to use a 12-inch knife to apply mud to the sides, only putting a little bit more mud in the center of the joint. Now we take off the mud, working in from the sides to the middle, and we work it until there's only a few ridges left. The band of joint compound might be as much as 2 feet wide when you're done.
To do the remaining side on our corners, we scrape off whatever ridges are left from the second coat and apply the mud, still using a 6-inch knife. Then we take it off with the same 3 strokes. The first stroke is along the outside of the mud. The second stroke is to clean anything off the opposite wall. And the third stroke gives it the final smoothing down.
Now we've gone through the second and third coats pretty quickly, but that's because they're basically about the same. And once you have the theory down, there's not much more to say about them.
But in practice, the second and third coats take the most skill and the most time, so don't be fooled. Now each coat in a basement this size takes 2 people at least 2 days. And no matter what treatment you give your ceiling, the last step in the drywall process is to sand down all the mud. This smooths out any of those last little ridges. Now, this is dusty work, so seal off the work area from the rest of the house and make sure you've got the proper protection for yourself. This should include dust masks that are rated for this type of dust. Generally, they're called respirators.
These are special sanders for drywall. The head pivots to allow you to sand quickly. When you're sanding, try to sand only where there's joint compound. If you run the sander over other areas where there's only drywall, you might scruff up the paper. And you only need to sand enough to get rid of the ridges. You can't try to even out a poor taping job. You can use either 150 to 180 grit drywall sandpaper or a drywall screen. Now the screen doesn't clog up as quickly as paper, but there's a danger of leaving an unattractive pattern on the smooth surface of the mud. Well, cleanup is a big part of any drywall project. When you get done hanging the rock, you're going to have dust and little pieces laying all over the place. And then during the process of putting on the taping and the compound, you're bound to get some of the compound on the floor. So plan on budgeting a little bit of time of energy into the cleanup process.
Well, we've covered a lot of material in a short time. You may want to go back and re-watch this tape a couple of times until you get real solid on the steps. And be patient with yourself, especially on the taping. Contractors tell us that new tapers take about 6 months on the job before they're real solid on the basics of taping. Thanks for watching.
We'll see you next time.